What if I told you that Ferrari knew perfectly well why Hamilton was going to fail in Austin sprint qualifying and didn't tell him anything until it was too late? What happened at the Circuit of the Americas during that Friday qualifying was not a simple drop in performance. It was an abrupt and painful revelation that something much deeper was rotten inside Ferrari. It was not just any session. It was Hamilton's real debut in a sprint weekend with Ferrari, a new structure with completely different dynamics from those of Mercedes, and which promised to be the beginning of a new era. And yet, it ended up being a brutal warning of the reality that awaited him. During free practice, everything looked perfect. Hamilton was leading comfortably, half a second ahead of the second fastest. The car, the SF25, seemed to have woken up with a solid and promising foundation. Everyone in the paddock assumed that Ferrari had finally found the right balance between qualifying pace and stability. But that mirage lasted less than 3 hours. As soon as sprint qualifying began, the car began to behave as if it were another car. Hamilton went from setting the pace in practice to losing almost a second to Verstappen's pole time. But the most alarming thing was not even that Max, in still inconsistent Red Bull, was 9/10 ahead of him. The devastating thing was that Nico Hülkenberg, with a Sauber client, a team that has not fought for anything for years, managed to surpass not only Hamilton, but the two Ferraris clearly. The difference was more than 3/10, but the emotional impact was even greater. How is it possible that a team with an infinitely lower budget, with limited access to resources, made a fool of the most historic team in the championship? Ferrari tried to overcome the humiliation with a speech repeated ad nauseum: configuration problems. But that justification no longer held any weight. There were too many previous signs that indicated that the team had been having problems for a long time. Hamilton, in his subsequent statements, was more honest than Ferrari would have liked. He said he did not understand what happened, acknowledged that the car was unstable and difficult to handle, and revealed that in SQ1 everything seemed normal, until suddenly the car began to collapse. And the worst thing is that Ferrari already knew what was going to happen. It all started with a phrase, a simple pilot observation that, in another context, might have gone unnoticed. But not this time. Lewis Hamilton, in the middle of the only free practice session of the sprint weekend in Austin, radioed an ominous warning. The gas pedal is really slippery for some reason. An ambiguous phrase, yes, but with explosive potential if analyzed in its real context. On a conventional weekend, they might have had 3 sessions to experiment, to evaluate, to understand. But this was a sprint, with just one free practice. There was no room for error. And Ferrari decided it wasn't worth the risk of modifying a car that had led the field, even knowing there were serious warning signs. This is where the human factor comes in. Because Hamilton, as a driver, trusted. He was confident that the team was interpreting the data correctly. He trusted that any abnormalities were already being corrected. He was confident that the car, which had dominated the morning, would remain competitive in the afternoon. But Ferrari did not tell him the complete truth. He did not share with him the level of internal uncertainty. They did not discuss the possibility of a failure in the response of the hydraulic system. They did not weigh the risks of not intervening. That slippery pedal was the first warning, an ignored alarm. And the result was a technical collapse that started with a seemingly minor detail, but ended up ruining the performance of the entire car in the most critical qualifying of the weekend. What happened with SF25 in Austin was not simply a configuration failure. It was the outcome of a truth that Ferrari had been trying to hide for weeks, that its 2025 car has an impossibly narrow operating window. And in Formula One, that phrase is equivalent to a death sentence. Austin is a complicated route. It has high-speed curves like the sequence in the first sector, aggressive braking zones, elevation changes, and above all, uneven asphalt that destroys mechanical grip. And if we add to that an ambient temperature above 30 degrees, with a track overheated by the Texas sun, we get the perfect setting to reveal the hidden defects of an unstable car. The SF25 never managed to get into optimal tire temperature. But the most frustrating thing was that Ferrari did not know how to anticipate it. Because their simulation tools, the heart of technical work in the modern era, failed. Matteo Tognanelli, head of track engineering, admitted it bluntly: our method was not able to predict the magnitude of the problem. A brutal statement which, in the mouth of a Ferrari engineer, has the same weight as a financial director saying that he does not know where the money is. In other words, Ferrari arrived in Austin without an accurate reading of how its car would perform. They were based on data that did not reflect reality. They didn't understand the interaction between the bumpy asphalt, the high track temperature, and the aggressive nature of the Pirelli compound. And as a consequence, the car not only did not perform, but it was uncontrollable. And what's even more alarming is that this wasn't the first time it happened. Already on circuits like Singapore, with similar characteristics of heat and potholes, the car had shown a tendency to degrade without prior warning. Only in Austin, everything got worse because the margin was even smaller, and the sprint format does not forgive mistakes. Charles Leclerc's frustration was revealing. When sprint qualifying ended, he declared, "I would be very surprised if we find something that makes us make such a jump." A devastating phrase for any team, but especially for one like Ferrari. It means that even the drivers were beginning to accept that the car had reached its ceiling, that there was no room for adjustment left, that they were trapped in a technical architecture with insurmountable limitations. And all the while, Hamilton struggled to find stability in a car that seemed to behave differently in each sector. What was once a confident corner was suddenly becoming a point of loss of traction. What seemed like a predictable car in practice turned into a box of surprises in qualifying. Ferrari had designed a high-precision car, but what this category needs is adaptability. Modern Formula One does not reward the car that performs only under ideal conditions. Reward the car that can stay in the fight when all else fails. The SF25, on the other hand, seems designed for a perfect race in a world that doesn't exist. And that is the biggest problem. Because it's not just that the car is difficult to set up. It's that when you don't give it exactly what it needs, it becomes completely ineffective. And that type of design doesn't just penalize performance. It also breaks the trust between the driver and the team. Because no world champion, not even Hamilton, can win if every weekend he needs to align himself with an impossible list of technical requirements. The SF25 window isn't just narrow. It's damn. And in Austin, he made it clear as crudely as possible. The question is not whether Ferrari knew what was happening, because the information was there. The symptoms had been reported. The simulations already showed inconsistencies. The engineer's frustration, although not publicly verbalized, was visible. What really matters, and what makes this case a more serious story than a simple technical error, is why Ferrari chose not to tell Hamilton anything until it was too late. It was not a casual decision. It was a strategy, and a deeply wrong one. Ferrari's culture, no matter how much it has tried to modernize in recent years, continues to be marked by a vertical, hierarchical logic where key decisions are made in small circles. In the case of Austin, everything indicates that the team decided not to alert its new star driver to avoid raising doubts just before the most critical session of the day, sprint qualifying. They believed that silence would maintain concentration, that it was preferable to protect trust, even if that meant omitting key information about the real state of the car. From a psychological point of view, the decision makes sense. But from a sporting point of view, it was an act of indirect sabotage. Hamilton is not just any driver. He is a 7-time world champion who built his legacy on the basis of preparation, precision, and absolute control of every variable. At Mercedes, I was used to surgical transparency. Any minimal deviation in telemetry was discussed in real time. Each microdata was put on the table. At Ferrari, on the other hand, he found a wall of silence, vague answers and decisions made behind the drivers' backs. When qualifying ended and he dropped to 8th position, Hamilton couldn't understand what had happened. His car had been dominant in practice. In SQ1 it seemed to be within the competitive range. But starting with SQ2, everything started to deteriorate at an alarming speed. Neither he nor his team managed to adapt. But the most serious thing was discovering, already in the garage, that Ferrari didn't know what was happening and had not told him. Paddock sources indicate that the technical team had detected since the previous day that the correlation between the simulator data and the real track data was broken. That there were alarming differences in the way the car heated the tires in the simulator compared to the behavior on the real track. An aggressive strategy change in the configuration was even contemplated before sprint qualifying. But the sports board decided that it was not worth altering the plan. That the car had been fast in practice, and that was enough of an argument to keep everything as it was. The 2025 United States Grand Prix not only exposed a technical failure by Ferrari. It was not a simple failed classification. What we experienced in Austin was brutal evidence that the Ferrari project with Lewis Hamilton is built on more fragile foundations than anyone even within the team dared to admit publicly. The problem was not the rhythm. The problem was the silence. It was the lack of transparency. It was the disconnection between a legendary pilot, who arrived to lead a new era, and a structure that, for fear of being vulnerable, ended up sabotaging its own leader. And now I ask you directly, do you think Ferrari can really build a solid project around Hamilton, or are we seeing the first signs of a fracture that cannot be repaired? Was this just a technical stumble or the start of a deeper pattern of strategic errors? Leave me your opinion in the comments.